The background property is one that's super useful. It has a lot of ways to implement and control, and it has a lot of sub-properties. Let's check out how we can use background. CSS Background Properties let us control the color, the images, the size of the images, the positions of the images. We have a plethora of ways that we can augment the background element. This property is really useful when working on responsive designs because we can make images work differently on small and large screens. The background property is made up of 8 other properties. We have background color, background image, background position, which allows us to move the image around within the container. We have background size, which is one of the most useful and most complex of the background properties. We'll look at this shortly. We have background repeat, background attachment, background origin, and background clip. You can use any combination of these properties that you like. And it is possible to not have to worry too much about the order. There's only a few things that you'll have to know, and I'll tell you what that is in just a minute. If you don't specify any of the properties, they will automatically be set back to their default values. We're going to be focusing on the first 5 properties. These are the ones that you'll use most often. Let's jump in and begin working with background. Here's the HTML file that we're going to be working on. This should look familiar because it's very similar to one that we used in previous exercises. I pretty much just have divs with their own unique classes. In the CSS, I have some basic rules along with the fact that I'm styling the divs to display as inline block. I'm giving them a width and a height. I have a border around them and a margin. Let's start off by adding background color to the first element. I'm going to use the background color property, and then I'll just specify a hex value. This is pretty straightforward. It just allows you to apply any background color to an element. You can use hex values, RGB, RGBA, HSL, or HSLA, so any of the color properties that we've talked about up until this point. For my second element, I'm going to use a background image. This will allow you to assign an image to the background. We pass in URL, and then we pass in parentheses, and we'll put the value inside of quotes. I'm going to navigate out of my CSS folder into the images folder, and I'll specify the image that I want to appear as the background. If we save and refresh, you can see that the background image has now been placed within this element. Now it is worth noting that my image looks like it's getting cropped off a little bit. Here's what the entire image should look like. The reason that it's getting cropped is because the size of the element is smaller than the picture. My picture is 300 pixels wide by about 170 pixels tall. The box is only 100 pixels tall. What we can do is we can use some of the additional background properties to control how the image sits inside the element. I'll do this on the next example. I'm going to use background image once again, and this time we're going to pull up another image. We'll add some additional background properties to example 3. So in addition to having the image of the fish, and let me show you what it looks like. Here's the image, and you can see we don't really see the fish. Let me just show you the image that I'm working with. It's quite larger than the size of our element. The image is 500 by about 281, so it's just showing us the top section of the image. By default, images are placed into the element so that the upper left-hand corner of the image aligns with the upper left-hand corner of the element. What we can do is we can control that by using our background position. For this particular element, I'm going to use center and left. If we save now and we refresh, you can see how the image has been repositioned within its containing element. The background position takes keyword values like top, right, center, left, and bottom. You can also put in length values or even percentages. Let me just go ahead and redefine background position. And we're going to go ahead and we're going to use a numeric value. So a lot of times you're not going to know what that numeric value is, so you'll just put something in there. I'm just going to put in 10 pixels and 100 pixels. We'll save and refresh, and you can see that the image is getting manipulated. Now, the image is actually repeating within this area. which I'll talk about in just a moment, but let me show you the trick that I use to get the positioning right. Because it's hard to know exactly how much you should offset the image, what should the horizontal offset be and what should the vertical offset be? In order to figure out what this is, I like to use my developer tools. So I'm going to right click, inspect the item, which is going to open up my developer tools. Since I have the div with a class of 3 highlighted, it's going to show me the styles that I have. And if you click on one of these values, you can actually change the value. You can numerically type in a different value, or I prefer to use my Shift and arrow key, which is going to move the element 10 pixels at a time. It is worth noting that you can use both positive and negative values. A positive value is going to push the element over to the right. So the reason we see this line right here is it's actually showing us 2 versions of the image. The image is repeating within the parent element. What I'm going to do is I'm going to move this element. Let's try -20. And then I'll come to the next value, the vertical value, and I'm going to start to adjust that as well. The lower the value, the more the image is pulled up until I get to 0. And now if I start to use negative numbers, you can see it's just taking up that repeated version. So for this particular element, if we use -20 and -60, it positions the picture so that we see 2 of the fish, the primary subject of the element. As you can see, having the ability to adjust the numeric values so you can visually dial it in is more helpful than trying to figure out what these numbers are. Once you've discovered the numbers that work, just make sure you update your file with those particular numbers. If we save now and refresh, you can see the image is positioned in the manner that I wanted it to be. Let's move on to example 4. For this one, I'm going to use a background image again. If I save and we refresh, you're going to see that this image shows up. Now I've created this image so that it will repeat, which is the default behavior. You can see how my image is a square image and the size of it is 92 by 91. Clearly, the element is not the same size. So what's happening by default is this image is tiling or repeating. That is the default behavior for images. We do have a property called background repeat. And if we specify no repeat and check it out in the browser, you can see that I'll just have a 1 tile of my image. So I definitely want the image to repeat. I will get rid of this, but I am going to add one more property. I'm going to add background color, and I'll pass in a hex value. And if we save now and refresh, you can see that my background color is appearing behind the image. This particular image is saved as a ping 24. It has transparency. The only part of the image that contains opaque artwork are the scales. The rest of it is transparent. This gives me a lot of flexibility because if I want to change the background color, all I have to do is redefine the background color and I can make this look very different. Now I want to show you what happens with the background repeat. So I'm going to target example 5. Once again, I'm going to apply a background image. I've prepared another image for us to use, and this one is called gradient.jpg. This image is a small image. It's only 43 by 86 pixels high, and it has a gradient along with a little bit of artwork at the top. We know that by default, images are going to tile. So if we save and we look at this, you can see that the image tiles seamlessly horizontally, but vertically it looks a little odd. Because the element is taller than the image, it will repeat. In this particular scenario, I do not want the image to repeat. So I'm going to go ahead and use my background repeat property. Now, if I select no repeat, it's just going to display one instance of the image. That is not really what I want either. What we want to do is we want to repeat the image in the horizontal or the X space. So I'm going to change the value here to repeat-X. Now when we save, the image is going to tile horizontally, but not vertically. If you wanted an image to tile vertically, you would use repeat Y. Now let's target example 6. We're going to once again set a background image. The image I have is called jellyfish.jpg. If I refresh, you can see we only see green, and that's because once again this image is much larger than my container. This image happens to be 600 by 338. We know we can reposition the image within the containing element, but because my element is quite smaller than the image, it's going to end up cropping off some of the jellyfish. What we're going to do for this example is we're going to use our background size property. As I mentioned, the background size property is one of the most useful properties to use, especially with images. Background size accepts auto, contain, or cover. Auto is the default value. If we use the value of contain and save and refresh, you can see that the image now shrinks down to fit inside of the element size. The background contain property says to always show the entire image, even if it has to leave a little space. So my image is actually tiling or repeating. If we used our background repeat and set it to no repeat, you'll see that only one instance of the image appears, but it has shrunk the image down so that it fits proportionately within the container. What we're going to do is we're going to get rid of the background repeat and we're going to change background size to cover. Now when I save and refresh, you can see that the image has changed. It's bigger. Cover is going to always make sure the image covers the entire container, even if it has to stretch the image or cut a little bit off on one of the edges. It does keep the proportions the same, but it will actually scale the image and make it larger. So if you use background cover on an image that is smaller than the containing element, it is possible that the image could get pixelated and the quality could deteriorate since it does stretch the image. Because our image is much larger, it is just clipping or cropping part of the image off. So in addition to using the background cover, I'm going to use background position so that I can position the image within the containing element. Let's just try center and bottom. If we save and refresh, you can now see that the image is positioned. And if I want to control this more precisely, I could always use numeric values. What we're going to look at next is background shorthand. This is the way that we can combine all of those properties into one declaration. This is the general syntax of the background property. We will specify background image, background position, we'll put a slash and add background size, background repeat, background attachment, background origin, background clip, and background color. Every property value needs to be separated by at least one character space. The order in which you define these does not really matter, except that if you're going to define background size, it needs to come immediately after background position, and they need to be separated by a /. Any property value that is undeclared will default back to its default value, or it may inherit from other style rules. Let's go ahead and let's use shorthand to define example 7. For this one, I'm going to actually do the exact same thing that I did on background 6, but I'm going to combine the values using shorthand. To use shorthand, we'll simply declare background. Now I'm going to specify my URL. After the background image, I'll use a space. Then I'm going to put the background position properties, which in this case are center and bottom. I'll use a / and then pass in cover. If we save, example 6 and example 7 are identical. These two rules are now displaying the exact same thing, but you can see on example 7 how I've reduced the number of declarations to simply using one. I'm using the shorthand notation to do so. The final thing that I want to show you in regards to backgrounds is the fact that you can actually add multiple background images. This is a really cool feature of CSS3. The syntax is fairly easy. You're just going to comma separate the various values. The main thing that you need to know when you're using multiple images is that the first image is the image that will appear on top of the vertical stacking order, since the images are going to overlap. You also need to be aware of the fact that if you use images that have no transparency and they sit over something else, they will completely cover up the underlying image. So when you use this feature, you probably want to use images that have some sort of transparency. I'm going to add 3 images. So I'm going to declare my first image, and this is a jellyfish icon. Then I'll use a comma and I'll declare my next image. We're going to use our scale image that we used earlier. Then I'll use a comma and we'll bring in the jellyfish image. If we save and refresh, you can see that all of these images are now appearing. Now, they are taking on the default properties. So my jellyfish icon is tiling or repeating. The underlying image, the scales, is tiling and repeating. And then behind everything is our jellyfish image, which is being clipped because the image is bigger than the element. So we're only seeing this like upper left-hand portion of the image. What I'm going to do is I'm going to add some additional properties so we can rein this in and have it display the way we want. The first thing that I'll do is I'll add the background size property. We'll go ahead and specify auto, and cover. I want the first 2 images to just behave as they automatically would. The final image, the jellyfish, I want it to use cover, as we did up above. Next, we'll specify our background position. This is going to control where the images appear within the parent element. For the jellyfish icon, I'm going to use 190 pixels and 10 pixels. I'll specify a comma. I'm going to use 50% for the horizontal and 50% for the vertical offset on the second element. This is just going to center it. We don't really need this since it's tiling, but we have to put something since we're using shorthand. And finally, I'll use center and bottom as we did above with the jellyfish image. The last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to control the repeating. So we will use background repeat. And for the values, the first image, the jellyfish icon, I don't want it to repeat. So I'm going to specify no repeat. I'll pass in a comma. The second image, I do want it to repeat. That's the scales. And then for the final image, the jellyfish, I'm going to use no repeat again. Now when I save and we refresh in the browser, you can see that all 3 images are appearing and we've controlled how their behavior is going to act within this containing element. The jellyfish image is using the cover behavior, so it's scaling down and showing the entire thing. The scales image, since it is transparent, we can see through and see the jellyfish behind, and it's just sitting on top of it and tiling. And finally, our jellyfish icon has been pushed over here to the right, and we're only displaying one instance of this particular element. Now, it is possible to use the shorthand method of applying all of these. You just need to be a little bit careful when you do this and stay organized, but you certainly can make your code a little bit more succinct. So what we're going to do here is we're going to start off by defining the URL of our first element. When you use shorthand on multiple images, you pass in all of the appropriate values for each image simultaneously. So first I'm going to do the background image, then I'll pass in the background position for the jellyfish. I want to make sure that I'm not comma separating any of these values. Then I'm going to use the / and add auto, which is the background size, and then we'll go ahead and pass in our repeat. And in this case, we want it to have no repeat. Now I'll add the comma, and then we'll go ahead and add in our second image. If you want to use returns, I find it a little bit easier to put these on separate lines. And we'll pass in the background position. Then we'll do our / and do background size, which is going to be auto for the second image. And finally, we'll add our background repeat. Then I'll pass in a comma, and I'm going to use the URL for the final image. I'll pass in the background position of center and bottom, /. We'll use cover for the background size, and then we'll use no repeat. Now, if I comment out all of these other iterations, our page should look exactly the same. And when I refresh, it does. We've just consolidated these 4 declarations into one declaration. So now you know how to use background images. You can see that this is an incredibly powerful feature of CSS. Background images can be used on the body element and really on any element that you're using inside your web pages. They can really help to add visual interest. And the best thing about background images is you can put text on top of any of these things. If I go back to my HTML, and let's say I go to example 2 and I simply write batray and we refresh, you can see how the text is now appearing on top of the image. Now I have not formatted the text in any sort of way, so the formatting is wonky and it's throwing things off because of some of our other CSS. But what I did want to show you is that it is possible to have text appear on top of an image. Using the background image is really one of the only ways that you can achieve this. I hope you've enjoyed this and you can start getting creative using background images on your projects.